There's a few objectives here that we're going to go over. It's a really interesting talk, and I'm glad you're all going to listen in on it. I'm going to try to take questions at the end, just so that I can get through the content, and then, that way, hopefully some of the questions you do have during the presentation can be answered later on, and if not at the end, I'm happy to take as many questions as possible. So with that, let's try and get started here. Sorry, this is going to take a wee bit of time just to load. Sorry, this is all right. So just a few things that we're going to touch on today. We're going to talk about the differences between Alzheimer's and dementia. We're going to talk about how Alzheimer's affects the brain, the risk factors of Alzheimer's disease, the 3 stages of the disease, and how they might be different. And then also we're going to very, briefly touch on some of the FDA-approved treatments, as well as ways you can get involved in clinical trials. We're going to talk a little bit about research. I'm also going to put a shameless plug in. I do research right now and have been in the dementia sort of related research field for about 5-6 years now. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about some of the stuff I've done if anyone's interested. And then I'm going to just close with some resources that are available through the Alzheimer's Association and ways that you guys can get involved and spread awareness. So let's get started with the impact of Alzheimer's. I think it's really important to start with the impact, just to get a sense of how big and how large Alzheimer's spans. I'll start by also saying that Alzheimer's can be a very personal disease. I want to be sensitive and keep in mind the fact that, and remind everyone that this presentation is not only going to focus on the patient and what the patient might manifest, but it'll also be focused on understanding the burden of caregivers and loved ones who care for those who have Alzheimer's, because this is not just localized, and the problem isn't just localized to the disease itself, but everyone involved in caring for the patient. And so I will present some facts and figures on caregivers as well. So we're going to start a little bit by testing our knowledge on Alzheimer's. Feel free to put in the chat box what you think some of the answers to these questions are. Sanjana, do you think you can gauge the chat box and see what people are saying?
Yeah, of course, I can do that.
Okay, cool, thank you. So the first question is, how many Americans do you think are currently living with Alzheimer's? Does anyone have any guesses? 5.8, it's a decent guess. Anyone else? So at the current moment, it's actually a little over 3 million. But with that said, the amount of cases is projected to rise. And in fact, by 2050, we're going to probably expect about 13 million cases. And it just shows that Alzheimer's isn't really a stagnant disease in terms of the cases that occur as time goes on. This is really a disease that we have to sort of understand and find treatments and figure out ways we can slow the progression of the disease and cure it, because this is something that is going to increase as time goes on, and is going to place a higher burden not only on caregivers, but also our healthcare system, which I'll get into a little later, just because of the sheer number of cases that are going to occur each year. There's another question here that I'm going to click on. Hopefully we can see if we can get this thing to move. think I'm gonna have to, Nicolette, can you get this thing to move? I don't think so. Hmm. Nicolette, are you controlling it?
Is it working for you? I can see you moving the mouse. Is it,
No, it's not actually working. I don't know why it's not. Do you still have control over it, or do I have to switch over to you?
no, I mean, I can control it, but I see it moving. Did it, try and click it right now? Like,
I don't think it's gonna go. It's very bizarre. Sorry, guys. Technical difficulties, inevitable. Part of every presentation. Yeah, it's okay. I think I'll let you control it, and then
okay.
we can just have it that way, because I think it's just kind of stalling from my end.
No worries. So is the screen updated now? It says how many unpaid
Yes.
caregivers? Okay.
Yeah, it's updated. Yeah, I'll let you control it, just because I think it's stalling on my end. Sorry, everyone. So there's another question that I'm going to put up. Just see what folks think. Feel again, feel free again to just post your answer in the chat box. How many unpaid Alzheimer's caregivers do you think there are in the United States? 1.2. Let's click on it. Not quite.
Prerna, our chat is disabled.
Oh, is
15.
okay.
Who else?
Sorry about that. Yeah, chat
16.
should not be enabled.
16.2. Yeah, so it's a lot. There's a lot of caregivers that we have that provide unpaid care for people with Alzheimer's or other dementias. If you think about the number of patients that are affected and the number of caregivers or loved ones that might be involved in the care, it is about threefold. And I want to specify, when we say unpaid care, what we're talking about is that these are people that are paying for care out of pocket. There's no sort of extra funding that is provided to caregivers. It's really just all through out-of-pocket expenses. And so there's a lot of money that is involved. In fact, caregivers are spending approximately $257 billion in total for care. And on top of that, caregivers have to take off from work. They have to manage responsibilities not only in their house, but also manage and consider the amount of responsibility there is with taking care of a loved one with Alzheimer's and their work responsibilities. And unfortunately, there's about 15.3 billion hours of work that's required to take care of someone with Alzheimer's. And the issue with the system now is when you get personal days or vacation days, it doesn't factor into some of the personal and more daring challenges that you might have with caring for someone. So you can also not be paid for those hours just because you're taking off more time than you're allowed. So these are all examples of ways that Alzheimer's really places a burden on caregivers. So let's see if we can move this. I think it's gonna stall again. Oh, Christ. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is Alzheimer's versus dementia. So it's very common for the two to be conflated to be the same thing. Alzheimer's is not the same thing as dementia. In fact, there are many different types of dementia, one of them being Alzheimer's. And so the way you can think about it is dementia is like the umbrella term, and underneath that umbrella is, multiple different types of classifications of dementia. There's like a visual and a graphic that is on this presentation that I think is great. And I'll kind of talk about that in just a second here. But in the meantime, I want to talk a little bit more about Alzheimer's and what really defines Alzheimer's in comparison to other dementias. For the sake of time here, because I ran into some technical difficulties, I will just answer some of these next questions so that we can talk more about the differences between Alzheimer's and other dementias. So to be clear, Alzheimer's is not a part of the natural aging process. The reason for this is often when people start forgetting things when they're older, they automatically associate it to Alzheimer's. There is a normal process that occurs as you age where you don't start to remember as much as you used to, and that is just a consequence of aging. However, Alzheimer's is a far more severe form of that process and abnormally accelerated, which leads to more serious cognitive deficits. So the analogy I like to use is it's not so much about losing your keys from time to time and saying, oh no, like where are my keys? I just put them here, and having that little slight, absence of knowledge, but rather it's what are these? How do I use my keys? And more specifically, that might be a more severe example, but more specifically, there are things that you and I might enjoy. So someone might enjoy gardening, or someone might enjoy planning, or having more organized ways of doing things. But if you have someone with Alzheimer's, they start to lose interest in the things that they loved and start to actually not just lose interest, but forget how to do those tasks. And so that's really important to understand, is it's not just about forgetting things from time to time, but it's really about, not being able to do the things that you were once able to, or really forgetting what something like a key is, or something that's a daily common item. This is a common question that everyone gets, what the difference is between Alzheimer's and normal aging. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that, because it can be a little tricky to try and understand the difference there. All right, so the next question here is, do people younger than the age of 65 get Alzheimer's? The answer is, in fact, true. So people under the age of 65 can get Alzheimer's. That's known as something called young onset Alzheimer's disease, which isn't as common as the normal form of Alzheimer's, but it is seen more now. And the most important way, or easiest way, to diagnose this form is really tracking, the changes that I mentioned earlier as soon as possible. So it's important to, watch out for your loved ones, because really you as a family member or as a loved one know when you see changes in a particular person, and you're really kind of the best detector to start that conversation of maybe seeing a primary care provider, or your nurse practitioner or your physician, whoever it may be, to address those changes.
Dementia is the umbrella term for an individual's changes in memory, thinking, or reasoning. There are many possible causes of dementia, and Alzheimer's is the most common cause. Other causes of dementia are vascular dementia, which is marked by changes in the blood flow and the blood vessels in the brain. Dementia with Lewy bodies, identified by specific brain changes throughout the brain that include the buildup of a protein known as alpha-synuclein. And frontal temporal dementia, which is marked by brain cell loss in the front sections of the brain or the frontal lobe. Each type of dementia may have distinct characteristics to cause specific behaviors in the individual, but there is also some overlap in behaviors among the types of dementia.
Certainly, having the diagnosis of Lewy body was helpful in our planning because we began to understand where this was coming from in the brain, where otherwise we would not have known. Like we knew something was happening, but what was it? To give it a label actually helped, although it was a big umbrella. It explains some of the characteristics and symptoms that we were experiencing and seeing.
So I want to talk a little bit about what Heather, as well as Gail talked about. Want to just summarize kind of the points they were talking about with the different dementias, as well as why it's important to seek a diagnosis early. So with respect to the first point, there are different dementias. Some of them that were mentioned were the vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, and frontotemporal dementia. They all sound like really fancy terms, and they each have their own symptoms. But often the way I think about it is that frontotemporal dementia is very shortly known as FTD, is usually characterized first by social changes, so behavioral changes. If you start noticing drastic behavioral changes, that's really what frontotemporal dementia is first classified by. A vascular dementia, they talked about it pretty well. Any sort of blood vessel or stroke that often causes a form of dementia is what's known as vascular dementia. And then finally, dementia with Lewy bodies is more related to Parkinson's. You'll start seeing bodily changes. It can affect the heart, the lungs, anything that's part of sort of the autonomic nervous system. And then, dementia usually follows the sort of the more movement or components of it. Not always the case. It can be the other way around, but that's usually what we see. The other thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon, which is the more important thing, is it's important to have a accurate and early diagnosis, because I think a really important point that Gail made is that it means a lot to folks to have a label on the changes that they're seeing. Without that label, it's really just this complicated change that is unexplainable and difficult to kind of handle. On top of which, it's so much easier and efficacious to start treatment when it's early to prevent the onset of the disease or the progression of the disease, rather than when we catch it at later stages. And so, early and accurate diagnosis is important because these diagnoses and aren't as simple. And the more physicians can sort of spend time with it and spend time with patients, the better diagnosis can be. Sorry, guys, this PowerPoint is lagging.
Certainly, having the diagnosis of Lewy body was helpful in our planning because we began to understand where this was coming from in the brain, where otherwise we would not have known. Like we knew something was happening, but what was it? To give it a label actually helped, although it was a big umbrella. It explains some of the characteristics and symptoms that we were experiencing and seeing.
I didn't mean to play that again, but I guess that's a nice reminder of what she said. So we kind of talked about this already, but dementia is really just a general term that encompasses a lot more diseases. Alzheimer's is not a normal process of aging, but we do also see that Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia for individuals above the age of 65. I should put that caveat in there because below that, frontotemporal dementia is actually the most common form of dementia for individuals below 65. This PowerPoint loves testing my patience. Okay. So before we kind of talk about treatments and resources and ways to get involved with the Alzheimer's Association, I'll talk a little bit about Alzheimer's in the brain and what is typical of Alzheimer's that we see in patients today.
More than 100 years ago, Dr. Alice Alzheimer's described specific changes in the brain, what we call the formation of plaques and tangles. Now, Alzheimer's is a progressive brain disease that's marked by these key changes and is thought to impact memory, thinking, and behavior. The brain has three main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Each one plays a role in how the body functions. The cerebrum fills up most of your skull. It is part of the brain most involved in remembering, problem solving, thinking, and even feelings. There are about 100 billion nerve cells or neurons throughout the brain that transmit messages in order for us to create memories, feelings, and thoughts. Alzheimer's disease causes nerve cells to die, which leads to the brain tissue loss, or what we call shrinkage, and causes loss of function and communication between cells. These changes can cause the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, such as memory loss, problems with thinking, planning, behavioral issues, and even at the end stages, problems with swallowing.
So a little bit more detail about Alzheimer's, a little bit about the history of how it sort of came to be. A while ago, in fact, 100 years ago, Dr. Alzheimer's was able to identify plaques in brain tissue. And these plaques are what helped identify the brain disease. And in fact, he noticed that these plaques and tangles caused nerve cells to die and caused that shrinkage that we heard about earlier. And this sort of impairs brain function because, you know, as you can imagine, any damage of nerve cells or any shrinkage of the brain hinders the ability for your brain cells to communicate with each other. And that is a critical component to the way we survive as humans, to the way we operate as humans. And so these plaques and tangles are really what pharmaceuticals now and what treatment nowadays in terms of pharmaceutical interventions try to reduce. And so we are making some headway. There's a lot of Alzheimer's drugs that are currently being that are being studied, but we'll talk a little bit about what treatment is available later on in the presentation. I want to talk a little bit about risk factors that are involved in Alzheimer's. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what the greatest known risk factor is for Alzheimer's disease? Yeah, that was pretty quick. Yep, age it is. So age is in fact the greatest risk factor. Kind of like what I mentioned earlier, we see this commonly with patients or individuals that are above the age of 65, though we do see Alzheimer's in individuals that are below the age of 65. It's common to see this as you get older. And as just a reminder, I was mentioning those changes in memory that occur as we age. And that change that occurs naturally is often a risk factor because our brains start to actually, our nerve cells or our neurons actually slowly start to become less efficient as we get older. And so age is a critical component of accelerating Alzheimer's. Sorry, this is going to cooperate with me. Come on, guy. You can do it. Sorry, guys, this PowerPoint does not seem to like me. Yeah, we did it. Set it. Are you able to get it? Thank you.
Alzheimer's disease is marked by specific brain changes that result in the clinical changes in individual experiences. That is, changes in memory, thinking, or reasoning. And ultimately, Alzheimer's is fatal. The exact cause for these changes is unknown, but there are some hints as to what may contribute to an individual's risk. Age is the greatest known risk factor for Alzheimer's. And when we look at populations of people, we see an increased risk over the age of 65. However, Alzheimer's is not normal aging. Family history is also a known risk factor. Research has shown that those who have a parent or a sibling with Alzheimer's are more likely to develop the disease, and that risk increases if more than one family member has Alzheimer's. When we talk about the genes involved in Alzheimer's, there are two categories that could potentially be involved: risk genes and deterministic genes. Risk genes increases an individual's risk for developing the disease, but does not guarantee that they will develop Alzheimer's. Deterministic genes, which are rare for Alzheimer's, guarantee that the person will develop the disease.
So the risk factors, are really important to identify. And this is a slide that I particularly think is important to stress. So a lot of times during Alzheimer's, we talk about genetic factors being a component, environment being a component. We don't often talk about the types of populations that are at greater risk. And I think, that's an important point for us, not only as healthcare providers or as healthcare personnel to focus on, but also something that everyone can help contribute towards. So we actually see that in the general population, Hispanics are about 1.5 times as likely as Caucasian populations to develop Alzheimer's and other dementias. And this is also true of African Americans, and women, in fact, are at higher risk of Alzheimer's as a community to begin with. And the reason I like stressing this is often in minority communities, the sort of resources that are available are not as readily publicized or not as readily available. And often, the sort of chicken and egg question comes into play. Is this disease more likely to affect individuals in minority communities because there's a lot of social stressors involved that accelerate the disease or the onset of the disease, or is it because there is a genetic component? And as of the current moment, again, there's a lot of studies that are being conducted to try and understand this relationship a little better. But on part of those who, people like us who volunteer at the Alzheimer's Association, and even as a researcher, one of the things that we're always mindful of is trying to include minority populations in research and trying to do as much as we can to spread awareness to those communities, because it is, again, very important that we consider what relationship minority communities have with the disease, given the social pressures that they face as well. So just to summarize about the risk factors, we know that age is the greatest known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and an individual's risk for developing the disease increases at the age of 65. Family history genetics is a huge risk factor as well. So often when you go to a physician or your healthcare provider, if it's a nurse practitioner or physician's assistant, they will ask you for a family history to see if you might have a predisposition to the disease. Another thing that's not mentioned on this slide that is available if you are truly interested in it is genetic counseling if you have a family history of disease. But that is a resource that you should first consult with your physician before getting into, because it can be expensive, but it is something that's available if you are interested in it. There are different types of genes that are involved. There are risk genes and deterministic genes that are associated. The most common gene that's associated with Alzheimer's is something called ApoE4. Often, if you do genetic testing for it, it usually means that that you are at a greater risk for Alzheimer's. But there are other genes that we're still trying to get a better sense of to see how they might play a role in progression and onset. And finally, a really important point, Hispanics, African Americans, and women are at an increased risk for Alzheimer's. And it is really important to make sure that we reach out to those communities as well.
One of the things that impacts our brain is all the other things that can happen to us as we age. And we know that Alzheimer's, the most common risk factor for getting Alzheimer's disease is age. But we also have lots of other things that go wrong with us as we age. And so how those other health factors impact our brain can also impact how Alzheimer's presents in other people.
Come on, guys.
Math, I can't do a simple tip anymore. I sit there, I stare at it. It's crazy what numbers I can't deal with anymore. And in some ways, that's the disease to me. The other thing that I've increasingly been struggling with are words, which I've dealt with words my entire life. As an avid reader, as a reporter, as a writer. I struggle with them now.
I'm like an overachiever. And when you're unable to deliver or you're not performing at the same pace that you once did before, that's frustrating. It's frustrating to not know where you place things. It's frustrating to not be able to explain to someone the problems that you're having. You can't articulate it in a way. It's frustrating to read something and you forgot what you read. It's frustrating to continuously have to change your password and you just changed it last week and you're constantly doing the same thing over and over again.
I think the thing that surprises me the most about my dementia is that it is progressive, and I'm finding that I'm forgetting more. And they do memory tests for me all the time at the doctor's, and so that becomes a little disconcerting at times to see my cognitive impairment continue to decline. But again, I really have hope. I don't live really in the future. I can't live in the future. I can't worry about what the future is going to bring. I have to live for today.
See if this thing cooperates again. Come on, guy. Let's do this.
Alzheimer's affects everyone differently. As a result, it's difficult to place a person in a specific stage of the disease. However, there are 3 general stages that are commonly referred to as early, middle, and late stage Alzheimer's. In a medical context, you may hear these stages referred to as mild, moderate, and severe. In the early stage of Alzheimer's, an individual may be able to function independently. However, they may start noticing more frequent memory lapses. Friends and family may also begin to notice difficulties in the person, and a healthcare provider may be able to detect problems in memory or concentration by conducting a detailed medical interview. Middle stage Alzheimer's is typically the longest stage and can last for many years. Damage to the brain cells can make it difficult to express thoughts and perform routine tasks, and this can lead to increased feelings of frustration and anger. In the final stage of the disease, an individual loses the ability to hold a conversation, control their movements, or respond to the environment around them. Cognitive skills, that is, their memory, thinking, and reasoning skills, continue to decline, and this can lead to personality changes and need for round-the-clock care.
So just a quick recap on the stages of Alzheimer's. There's the early, middle, and late stage of Alzheimer's, and they're often referred to within the healthcare community as mild, moderate, and severe. We do tend to see a difference in symptoms per individual. So even though there was that criteria that was provided on the previous slide, it does look different for everybody. And it's still something, again, that really you as a caregiver would be at the best position to try and understand if, if you're forgetful, you tend to be a forgetful person like me, if I might, seem like I'm in a moderate stage, when in reality I'm in an early stage, whereas someone like my grandpa who remembers every single detail, if he starts, forgetting things that he would remember, considering the fact that excluding the fact that he is older, he might be in a later stage of disease, even though he doesn't have a strong symptomology. And so it really does depend on the person. And that's why we have different clinical tests, different cognitive tests, which are a big component of diagnosing Alzheimer's, and imaging, MRIs, and trying to see what the tissue looks like is also another important objective measure to see how Alzheimer's might affect the individual. So the other thing and last thing I want to stress is that the rate as well as at which people progress through each stage is also different. It's not like, this person's going to stay in the mild stage for 6 months, the other person's going to stay there for, another person might stay there for 2 years. It really just depends on the person, and it depends on each individual. So this is the part that I'm going to touch a little bit upon. I won't get into too much detail. If you're interested in more details about the treatments, feel free to reach out. Also feel free to reach out to your physician. But we'll start first with just testing your knowledge on what you think of the treatments. Does anyone know if there are drugs right now that are available to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's? True, that's pretty much what I'm getting here. So there's actually no drug on the market that slows down the disease, but there are things that sort of mute the symptoms or prevent sort of the symptoms from getting more severe. So we'll hear from the expert. This is also another one of those tricky questions. Hopefully this will clear it up.
To treat the cognitive symptoms associated with Alzheimer's disease. They treat the symptoms, but they don't treat the underlying cause. So eventually people will progress, but they do treat some of the symptoms and help people for a time. So the first class of drugs are cholinesterase inhibitors. These drugs work to prevent the breakdown of acetylcholine, which is a chemical messenger found in the brain that's associated with learning and memory. There are 3 FDA-approved drugs that are in this class of drugs. There's Aricept, there's Exelon, and there's Razidine. There's another class of drugs that's modulates glutamate, which is another chemical messenger in the brain that's associated with learning and memory. And this drug is called Namenda. And then there's a final class, which is actually a combination of cholinesterase inhibitors and glutamate modulator, and this is called Namzaric.
So there's 3 types of drugs that are approved by the FDA, just to review. We had our expert kind of talk to us about cholinesterase inhibitors. We talked about Aricept. There's other ones like Exelon and Razidine. We also have glutamate modulators like Namenda, and then we have combination inhibitors. Really, the way to, again, if you want to talk more about the mechanism of actions for each of these drugs, I'm happy to discuss it, one-on-one. But the general thing that you can think about is that, these 3 drugs are really there to try and improve communication between the nerve cells. And again, the treatments only address the symptoms of Alzheimer's. They do not actually treat the underlying cause of the disease. Let's do this. Now, this is my favorite part, which is the part about research and advancing research with respect to Alzheimer's. In the last decade, there have in fact been enormous strides in Alzheimer's research and understanding the disease. For example, in the research that I've been doing, we're able to pinpoint risk factors that are associated with the disease a little better. We're looking at biomarkers of proteins in the body, using imaging and cognitive testing as really important measures. And so we've been able to see some remarkable sort of discoveries that are being made, as well as in the pharmaceutical industry. And so, there are a lot of people think that we haven't really, gone anywhere with the research, but in fact, there have been enormous strides. And again, I'm happy to talk about that at the end.
This is an incredibly exciting time in Alzheimer's and dementia research. The advancements that we've made in the last decade to understand the disease is a continuum, meaning that the biological changes are starting a decade or more before someone is experiencing the changes in the memory and thinking. This sets the stage for possible prevention. The idea that when we have the tools to identify those individuals at the earliest time point, and when we have the interventions to target individuals at that earliest time point, we can intervene to stop or slow the progression of the disease before an individual loses their memories.
I'm excited about what we're learning these days regarding lifestyle. One of those things that we've seen in the past are things like exercise and nutrition have now started to gain more momentum to indicate to us that it can change your ability to slow cognitive decline. That is really the first stages of Alzheimer's disease. This may include things like social engagement, mental cognitive training. It can be things such as exercise. It can be nutrition. All those things are now starting to point that they will lower your risk for Alzheimer's disease.
A lot of hope does come from the Alzheimer's Association, all the research that is being done. Even though there is not a cure today for the disease, I know in my heart there is going to be a cure one day. And I know we're getting closer for that cure. Because even if you fail in a research study, you learn from that failure in the research study. That failure always brings progression.
It's nice to see the association spearheading in many ways the emphasis on getting the money at the federal level and at the private sector to get the research done so that someday there will be an effective treatment, hopefully cure, hopefully prevention.
I want to also touch on clinical trials and how to get involved. I think this is a really important subject that a lot of people are interested in.
More important than ever for people to participate in clinical studies. The fact is, right now, we don't have an effective treatment to stop Alzheimer's disease. And if we don't have people participating in clinical trials, we never will. And so participating in a clinical study is one way that everyone can get involved in a very direct way in the fight against Alzheimer's disease. And for people who currently have dementia or Alzheimer's disease, there are some additional benefits. You get access to very close medical care. You also may be among the first people to have access to the treatments that will eventually prove to work.
Sometimes you hear the phrase, it's a failed trial. That means that it didn't hit the endpoint, it didn't achieve an FDA-approved drug. But I would say as a scientist, the only failed trial is one that doesn't give you valuable information. And if the trial is well designed, if it is a good scientific experiment, you get extremely valuable data so that you can plan the next trial and do the next study even better than the last one. And it gets you that much closer to that FDA-approved drug, to that effective treatment, and maybe someday even a cure.
So a little bit about the Alzheimer's Association. I want to talk about resources that are available to get involved, and also ways to get any help if you would like. So the Alzheimer's Association is really a nationwide association. So we do have a chapter here in New Jersey, but if you are in another state, you can definitely get involved. We're really here to advance research, to provide awareness not only on the national level, or excuse me, the state level, but also the federal level. And we really are trying to reduce the risk of dementia through the promotion of brain health. I am going to provide a couple of phone numbers that I think are really important to have in case you have any other questions and want more information. Let's see if this will let me advance it. Yes, it will. So I'd highly recommend taking down this phone number. The first is a helpline that's available to you 24/7. It's 1-800-272-3900. This is our general helpline. You can also visit our website, alz.org, that can provide a lot of resources to you. For example, this presentation should be up on that website. And it's also provided in communities nationwide if you just type alz.org/CRF. Let's move on. Let me here. Come on, buddy. And just ways to join the fight, which I think is important for everyone to know in case you're willing to get involved and volunteer. So some of the things that we do will be explained in the slide right here. We have a lot of opportunities available. You can be a presenter, a community educator, like I do. You can present and spread awareness about the disease. You can also be a community representative, so help bring awareness to your community. You can be an advocate, which we always enjoy having advocates. We talk to congressmen and women about different bills and ways that they can help support Alzheimer's research. And so that's a really interesting and fun thing to do. We also have the Walk to End Alzheimer's, which is usually done annually. Obviously, COVID sort of prevented us from doing that this year, but we are looking to do this again. And if you want more information on that, you can feel free to research, just type in alz.org/walk. And finally, I want to leave some room for questions. So let me do one more thing here. I think that's it. I think it'll. Sorry, guys. Well, if it won't advance this, I will just end on one last note, which is that we also have the longest day, and the longest day is basically an event where we have during the summer solstice, we actually have an event where we raise funds and awareness for the care and support of research efforts for the Alzheimer's Association. So we have that available, and also, like I mentioned, Trial Match is a really important website or resource to visit if you are interested in a loved one registering for a clinical trial. Of course, you should always consult your physician before registering for a clinical trial. And so with that said, I will end the presentation. Again, sorry guys for the technical difficulties. I am not a fan of that. But I am happy to take questions. I think there's quite a few in the chat box. Can I have Sanjana or Nicolette, somebody to kind of like pick out some questions? I know there's quite a lot.
Yeah, I could read out the questions. So
Okay, great, thanks.
the first one I saw a couple minutes ago was, how successfully, percentage-wise, do you think the world is with the ongoing advanced research in finding a cure to the disease?
It's hard to say percentage-wise, but I will say this: there's a lot of research being conducted worldwide. The U.S. and I used to work at Penn, so we did research with folks in Spain, with folks in Brazil, where we're trying to conduct a worldwide effort on trying to understand, how genetics might play a role in different populations. So it's kind of hard to place a percentage, but kind of like I mentioned in the presentation earlier, we have made a lot of strides in understanding the molecular biology as well as genetic components and imaging components that are involved in the disease.
Great, thank you. I think we have 3 more questions. So one more is, could you provide some insight into what your current research in Alzheimer's entails?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about it very briefly. Again, I don't want to bore folks that aren't interested. But what we do, or what we did in Penn, is we use imaging, so MRIs. We use cognitive testing. So there's this huge booklet of cognitive testing that physicians use if they're researchers, that allows them to track the progression of the disease. The physician might even do like a smaller version of this when, a patient comes in to see them. They might say something like, here are 3 words: apple, chair, and cup. They might have you do a few more tasks and see if you can follow them in the tasks. And then they'll say, hey, can you remind me? And they might say, hey, do you remember those 3 words that I told you about in the very beginning? They might have you draw certain figures. So those are all kind of small cognitive tests that are done. We also take fluids from the body to try and see whether proteins that that they have predispose them to Alzheimer's. And so there's a lot of so basically we mix that, the cognitive testing, the MRI, as well as the protein. So we track all 3 of those things in patients that are interested in doing research. And what was the third one there, Sanjana?
Yeah, I saw 2 more questions in the chat. So
Sure.
The second to last one was, the medical field focuses on cure rather than prevention. How do you think we can take care of this? Are you aware of any plausible or if any nutritional deficiencies that cause Alzheimer's?
So there's not clear evidence or a hardcore piece of evidence that suggests one type of nutritional deficiency leads to Alzheimer's. However, and also that's a very good point about prevention rather than cure. I went to nursing school, and so I'm huge on prevention rather than just popping a pill and curing it with a pharmaceutical intervention. So kind of on the line with diet there. There are some diets that are suggested. One is the ketogenic diet. The other is, Mediterranean diet. But all in all, what matters is eating healthy in terms of eating greens and avoiding processed foods, obviously avoiding things like smoking and excessive alcohol consumption, because ultimately what matters is the blood flow to your brain and how effectively your brain functions. And so if you kind of eat processed foods, you're eating fast food every day, you're sort of eating these foods that are manufactured and not, homemade. Sometimes what tends to happen is there's inflammation that occurs. You can have plaques, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests that cardiac health is linked to dementia and how well or how much it progresses in the onset of dementia. So it's important to keep your heart healthy so that your brain is also healthy, essentially. So there's a lot of preventative research that's being done on nutrition, and the answer is yes, nutrition does play a role in disease. We just don't know to what extent. The other part of research that's being conducted right now is something called cognitive reserve. Very briefly, that's a concept that suggests that sort of professional and daily activities that we participate in can delay onset or slow progression. We again don't know to what extent, but there are research studies that are ongoing that point to evidence that good behavior in terms of health, in terms of exercise, and in terms of keeping your mind stimulated and active can delay onset and slow progression. Any other questions?
Okay, so I see two more. So one of them is, what are your thoughts on the FDA recently approving aducanumab? I can't say that. As a drug therapeutic to treat AD. I know that there was a lot of controversy behind its approval, so I was just curious to see what commentary, if any, you had on that.
Yeah, so it is controversial, and it's funny you mentioned that. It's something that we just talked about as an association. It is a controversial drug, but it's controversial in the sense that it really depends on the person. So, it's important that when you consider, a drug, I'm not a physician. The reason I'm hesitant to answer this question is it really depends on the person and their medical situation. I'm not a physician, emphasis on that. And so I cannot comment on the extent to which the drug is effective in certain individuals, but it can certainly be effective for some cases. And again, that's really up to the physician to decide. It is not a bad drug. So if the question is is this something that's going to be more harmful than beneficial? That's not something that is the case with the drug. But in terms of side effects and other sort of questions regarding whether it is efficacious, best to ask your physician.
I would say, so this is Nicolette with the association. So I would say I had a lot of questions myself, and there's a lot of information still coming out. And every class that I take, I'm learning more. And as far as the association, why we have stood behind it is because if you look at any kind of condition, whether it's cancer, it's diabetes, it's heart related, what have you, when new medication is going to come out, there's going to be back and forth, people that agree with things and people that don't. And right now what was approved was a conditionary FDA approval. So it does say that there needs to be further studies done. So we have agreed to that. If something was, rushed and they said, everything is good, no more studies, this is the answer to everything, we probably would have not stood behind that. But we've seen the trials, we've seen, the research, and because we're a science-based organization, we're seeing what the research is. And, it is I think a lot of feedback has been about the cost, and that's a concern. So again, why Priyana has said, like, advocation is so important. We need to stand up and say, whoa, everyone should have access to healthcare. If there's something that's going to help people, everyone should get that. So really, important that, continuing the research portion, but also advocating for things that are going to help everyone, if that's a possibility, or everyone that qualifies, to get that help.
Yeah, thanks, Nicolette. Very important points. Hopefully that answered some questions. But yeah, there's still a lot of stuff coming out about the drug. So it's an ongoing process regarding understanding it.
Yeah, definitely agree. Thank you so much for that informative answer. I definitely didn't know about that. The last question I see is, how good is our capability to predict Alzheimer's?
I think for right now, we have a pretty good gauge. We have a pretty good gauge of predicting it for definitely individuals that have a genetic history. I used to work in a research facility where we did a research study on individuals that had a strong family history for disease. And they actually agreed to enroll in a longitudinal or long-term study to see if we could, track disease. We could track disease through the research study. Again, I don't want to say that, like, oh my goodness, once this person started having this diagnosis, we were able to label it exactly. But there is a good sort of indicator for those who have a genetic history of disease. And the other thing I will say is, often, unfortunately, we cannot detect when the onset of Alzheimer's is in the patient, because we don't start noticing that someone has Alzheimer's until the symptoms present. And brain imaging actually suggests that folks start the onset 10 years before you start seeing symptoms. So we aren't exactly excellent yet at predicting onset, which is what research is trying to do right now. But with cases of genetic history and strong family history, we are more cautious of observing individuals and asking them questions regarding onsets of their family members to better hopefully track their progression and behavior. So, short answer: genetic history, we are better, but still a long way to go. And for folks that don't have a family history, it's much trickier, and we still have a lot of research to do.
Thank you so much again for answering all those questions. I think that's all I see in the chat. So if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to put them in there or turn your mic on. And I just want to say thank you so much, Prerna and Nicolette, again, for doing this amazing presentation. I definitely didn't know about the drug therapeutics and a lot of things in this presentation that I'm sure that I myself and many others learned. So thank you so much again for presenting. If anyone has any questions, please let us know.
Thanks for having us. And actually, we are actually in the training process. A new program is going to come out with information about the new medication. So that I'm told that training